Hi everyone, when did Homer, the Greek poet, really live? He's often placed in the 9th century BCE, sometimes the 8th century BCE, and occasionally the 7th century. But which one of those is actually correct? Well, let's take a look at the evidence. Okay, so the main piece of evidence for a 9th century date, so the 800s BCE, is the testimony of Herodotus. So Herodotus was writing in the 5th century BC, around the middle, and according to him, Homer lived no more than 400 years before him. So when we count back from the middle of the 5th century, we get to the 9th century. We get to around about the middle of the 800s, 850 BCE more or less. So that is the main basis for the idea that Homer was a Greek poet of the 9th century BCE, which would make him a very, very early poet indeed. But obviously it wouldn't be very wise to establish the date of Homer on just one piece of evidence. And that's especially so when we pay attention to what Herodotus actually said. So remember, as I quoted, Herodotus says that Homer lived no more than 400 years before his time. So the 9th century BCE isn't when Herodotus thought Homer actually lived. That was the upper limit. He said Homer lived no more than 400 years before his time. So that was the upper limit of his estimate of when Homer lived. So that obviously raises the question, what did Herodotus have in mind when he was estimating what seemed to him to be a reasonable upper limit? What was he basing that on? Well, we know that Herodotus had a tendency to use an average generation length of about 33 years, or about 3 generations to a century. That was an average generation length as far as Herodotus was concerned. So when he said Homer lived no more than 400 years before his time, creating an upper limit, surely he used more than the average. Maybe he used a generation length of about 40 years for that estimate to arrive at a reasonable upper limit for Homer's antiquity. So if that's the case, then that means that those 400 years would represent 10 generations of 40 years each. Obviously, this is just speculation. We don't know how Herodotus arrived at that estimate, but it seems like a reasonable speculation to me. I'm not aware of any other plausible idea for what Herodotus was basing this estimate on. So the idea that he was using an estimate of 10 generations, each one a long generation of 40 years, to arrive at 400 years total, that seems like a reasonable solution to this problem. But of course, this would mean that if we use a more realistic generation average, then those 10 generations would result in less than 400 years. So that would bring Homer far closer to the time of Herodotus than the 9th century. For example, if we were to use just 25 years per generation, then that would place Homer just 250 years before Herodotus was writing. So that would imply that his birth was in around 700 BCE. But now a really interesting question is, does that accommodate the evidence in the Iliad? After all, Homer was the composer of the Iliad. Now, before you write in the comment section, oh, Homer didn't exist, so he can't have written the Iliad, so that's irrelevant. Someone wrote the Iliad, okay? It's widely accepted today that the Iliad is the work of a single mind. It is one unified work of poetry. One composer created it. Yes, sure, it comes from pre-existing tradition, all that, but someone wrote or composed the Iliad itself. So that person has been known since antiquity as Homer. There is no basis to separate Homer from the composer of the Iliad. So when I talk about Homer, obviously I'm talking about the person who composed the Iliad. So we will call him Homer as there is no reason whatsoever to do otherwise. So when we look at the Iliad, we find that the descriptions of the world, the descriptions of the geopolitical world in Greece, in Anatolia, in that whole area, the armor that was used, the weapons that were used, the modes of warfare that were employed in the battles that Homer describes, all these things match the late 8th century or early 7th century. Now this goes against what you may well have heard, particularly from online sources. What generally happens is the most up-to-date scholarship is generally proposed and created through papers that are submitted to to university journals or other journals, and then the conclusions from these papers are then used for other papers and books, and then from books it tends to slowly trickle down into the public consciousness, and then you find it in online articles and videos. But the problem is this process takes decades. So no doubt if you're watching this video, you're interested in ancient Greece, you may well have seen videos about how the Iliad matches the Mycenaean era, the Bronze Age. It doesn't. And scholars for decades now have been explaining that the world that Homer described matches the Archaic era of Greece. Archaic Greece, not Mycenaean Greece. There are many academic explanations of this topic, and I'll put some links to some of them in the description below. But the point is, when we look at the Iliad, it's clearly the work of a composer who lived around about 700, maybe a few decades later, not realistically a few decades before, for the following reason. Scholar Hans van Wees explained through a comprehensive analysis of the Iliad compared to Greek art from the time that the frequency with which various different weapons are used in the Iliad closely matches the period from 700 to 650 BCE, whereas it doesn't match at all the period prior to 700 BCE. So Greek art, like Greek pottery that shows artwork, that shows scenes of battles, from before 700, basically from 750 to 700, the frequency with which different weapons are used, like swords, spears, bows and arrows, is completely different to what we find in the Iliad. So for instance, in the Iliad, swords are almost never used, whereas in Greek artwork from before 700 BCE, we find swords portrayed frequently. Whereas after 700 BCE, from 700 to 650, we find that swords are almost never depicted, which matches Homer's Iliad. And not just swords, but the others as well. Just generally, the frequency with which different weapons are used in the Iliad is a almost perfect match for the frequency with which those weapons are depicted on Greek art from 700 to 650 BCE. So that indicates that the Iliad is a product of the period between 700 and 650 BCE, which obviously indicates that that's when Homer lived. And then that brings us to another interesting point, that the earliest depictions of the Trojan War on Greek artwork date back to about 700 BCE. But it's not until basically the last quarter of the 7th century, about 625 BCE, it's not until then that we find depictions of scenes that seem to match exactly scenes in the Iliad. So it doesn't seem that the Iliad actually had any influence on Greek artwork depicting scenes of the Trojan War until the last quarter of the 7th century. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that the Iliad didn't exist before then, but it does indicate that it wasn't famous before then, or it's unlikely to have been famous, because if it was already famous and people were already in the custom of creating scenes of the Trojan War, then why wouldn't they have adapted scenes or portrayed scenes from the Iliad, which we know they did later? So to me, that suggests that the Iliad wasn't written long before 625. I think that a reasonable estimate is about 650 for the composition of the Iliad. Now, another piece of evidence for this late date for the Iliad, a late date for Homer himself, which I've not seen anyone else mention, actually comes from ancient biographies of Pythagoras. So Pythagoras was born in 570 BCE, and according to ancient sources, his tutor was a certain Hermodamas of Samos. And he, in turn, was the son of Creophilus. Now, the reason why that's so important is because Creophilus, according to ancient sources, was a friend and therefore contemporary of Homer. So let's think about this. If Pythagoras was born in 570 BCE, and his tutor was then probably born, let's say, 50 years, just as a working example, 50 years before Pythagoras. So that means that Hermodamas would have been born in around about 620 BCE. So his father, if we assume he was born as much as 30 years before him, Creophilus, he would have been born in 650 BCE. And he, as I said, was allegedly a friend of Homer. So we see that Homer can't have been a figure of the 9th century, absolutely not. He also can't have been a figure of the 8th century either, if this tradition about him being a friend of Creophilus is correct. This tradition clearly makes him a 7th century figure. Personally, I think that the dates which best accommodate the available evidence are about 680 for Homer's birth and 650 for the composition of the Iliad. So that accommodates him being a contemporary of the father of the tutor of Pythagoras. And it also accommodates the depiction of the world and the weapons, the warfare being used in the Iliad, as well as the estimate given by Herodotus when we accommodate the fact that he does explicitly present it as an upper limit. So a more reasonable limit would indicate a date around about the 7th century. And while that's a lot later than many of the ancient Greek estimates for when he lived, this is a phenomenon that we see a lot. It's actually a trend in ancient Greek historiography that a lot of the ancient estimates for events and people exaggerate the antiquity of them. So it's not unexpected, it's not strange or anything like that to find that Homer actually lived later than the ancient Greeks themselves generally thought. But of course, if you have another point of view about Homer's life, then feel free to put that in the comments below. Now, if you'd like to see the next part of my investigation into whether the real King Arthur was actually Athros, son of Meirig, then come back next time for my next video.